I mean, the cool thing is that a lot of the things that you can do to make your brand acquirable are the same things you should do to build a healthy business. So I think thinking that way can actually, as long as you don't get too far ahead of yourself, can help you make the business into something that you want to keep. I mean, eventually making it so that it can run without you. And you can't do that in the very early stages of a business. Like, I'm not doing that yet with They Got Acquired, my new company, because I'm just figuring out like, what are the things that we're even doing? Once you figure them out, then you can have someone else.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today's guest is Alexis Grant, who's the founder of theyGotAcquired.com. It's a newsletter and website that focuses on startups that have been acquired for more than $100,000 but less than $50 million. So she's trying to really draw the spotlight on these smaller acquisitions, which often get missed in the media frenzy. Alexis has a background in journalism, but created two of her own companies that got acquired themselves. One was an agency that got acquired by Penny Hoarder, and the second was The Right Life, which she sold last year so she could focus full-time on theyGotAcquired.com. For many of you listening, you might be looking to sell your business in the range that she talks about. So it's a great idea to follow along on her website and learn more about the opportunities available. I hope you enjoy listening. Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, Alexis. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really curious to understand how you went down the path you did in terms of entrepreneurship and building your own micro businesses, and then leading you to then They Got Acquired.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I can give you a little rundown of my background. I started my career as a journalist. I worked as a reporter for a couple of mainstream journalism outlets. I think that was really helpful. And looking back, I think just having experience in a traditional newsroom kind of helped me get my feet under me, I understood what was expected in an office. I made a lot of really good connections that would help me later in my career. But I ended up starting my own business and just really getting hooked into running businesses, which really surprised me because I loved being a reporter and never expected to give that up. And I had really resisted, taking business classes when I was at university, for example, because I just wasn't really interested in that. But what shifted for me was when I started taking on some clients at the time in the early days, I started off as like a social media freelancer. I started doing that and then also releasing some ebooks, and just realized that by doing my own thing, I had a lot more freedom. I could earn a lot more money. I do it on my own terms, and it was really fun. And once I saw that shift, that's kind of when I got hooked into running my own business.
And did you do that on the side to begin with and then go full-time later on? Or did you go straight and make the jump straight away?
When I was like 27, I left my full-time job to go traveling for a while. And I went backpacking around French-speaking Africa. And when I got home, I ended up moving back in with my parents, and I wrote a book. I spent a year and a half writing a book. And that was the point where I started looking for a job and thinking, how do I want to spend the next phase of my career? And that was when I started taking on some clients for the first time, really just kind of on a lark. And because I had these skills online that a lot of businesses needed, and it was a way for me to earn some money when I was looking for a job. But then I ended up getting a job. So the client work that I had done very quickly became a side hustle. So I was working a full-time job. I was working at US News and World Report as a careers and jobs reporter. And then on the weekends and in the evenings, I was running my side hustle. But I only worked there for a year. And then I realized that, I really wanted to go full in on running my own business. So it pretty quickly became a full-time job for me.
What was that first business, and how did you go about making it your full-time income?
Mm-hmm. So my first business it started as social media marketing, but it morphed pretty quickly. I realized that even though a lot of businesses wanted to hire freelancers for social media, this was in like 2009, 2010, I didn't love that part of the business. And so we ended up pivoting to do content marketing. So we did include some social media in that, but the main business premise was we were running blogs for companies. So this was when, it was years ago. So the landscape was a little bit different, and there weren't a ton of people offering these services where we could really run the blog for you. I ran that business for 5 years. before it ended up getting acquired by a company called the Penny Hoarder. So the Penny Hoarder was one of our clients because we are running blogs for businesses. We were running their content shop for about a year and a half before the founder purchased my company and then brought myself and my team in-house there to run that operation. So that was that's how I got started. And on the side of running this small agency, I was also working on ebooks because, I'm a writer, like at heart, I'm a writer. And so I launched several different ebooks, and that was the part that I really enjoyed. Like I thought it was really fun. I was kind of building my own blog, my own email list, and experimenting in that way. My first ebook the topic of it was how to start a part-time social media business. So it was really what I was doing at that time and teaching other people how to do it. From there on, for the next few years, I released a new ebook or course like every year or two. And some of them worked and some of them didn't, but I got to try a lot of different things. And it let me be kind of creative on the side of the agency.
So with the Penny Hoarder buying your first agency, was that something you had in mind or something you wanted in the future? Or did it take you by surprise when they approached you and said, we want to buy you?
Yeah, it was not something I had in mind. In fact, I had in my brain that I would never become an employee again because I just loved the freedom. And it was during this time when I met my husband, and right after we got married, he quit his job. He was working at a law firm to work for himself. So we had this vision of like both of us running our own businesses and having lots of flexibility in life to travel or, just flexibility over our schedules. And so when the founder, Kyle of the Penny Hoarder, approached me about buying the company, my first reaction was thinking, I'm not sure that I want to become an employee again, but it ended up being a really good fit. It was an opportunity to do something that was much bigger than what I was doing on my own. So I got to learn a lot by taking him up on that. And it still felt very entrepreneurial because, I was a second hire at the company, and I got to build out the content shop. And, we worked well together in terms of thinking about what the future of the company should look like. So I still felt like I had a lot of autonomy, and it was still really fun, even though I was technically an employee.
And I imagine it must be really difficult because I know there's lots of people who might be listening today who have got their own businesses, but they never really considered that somebody might buy them out one day. Was it hard in terms of knowing what price to charge or how much money you wanted? How did you do all those calculations? Like, how did you know what your business was worth?
Yeah, well, it was an acqui-hire. And what an acqui-hire means is that the company buys you for the team rather than like for the product. No, so for example, we let go of all of our other clients when we went in-house at the Penny Hoarder. So really what they wanted to do was apply the systems that we created and the people that we trained to building the content shop specifically within the Penny Hoarder. And then we also brought in our freelance, like our network of freelance writers. In an acqui-hire, for me at that point, I think my thinking has changed on it since then, but really the question I asked myself then was just what makes it worth it for me? I wasn't trying to put a valuation on the business necessarily. It was more like, what makes it worth it for me and my team? What makes this a good move? So that's how I thought about it at the time. And I mean, honestly, I feel like even though that's a very simple way of thinking about it, it does work if you're trying to think about how to value a business, because no matter what valuation formula you use, the only thing that matters in the end is whether it's worth that much money to you and to the buyer. And if you could find common ground there.
Did you have any difficulty in convincing the other members of your team to move with you? Because obviously, if it's hiring your team to do that, were some of them, for a freelance network, did they want to do different projects and now coming onto one person? Was there any apprehension about that?
Well, not everyone came. So one of the requirements was that because we were building the Penny Hoarder office in Florida, and I lived in DC and my team was scattered everywhere. And I actually stayed in DC for another 2 years before I moved down there, because at the same time this was happening, I was about to have a baby as well. So it was a very busy personal time for me. But one of the requirements for joining the company at that time was that you move to Florida. So not everyone on my team wanted to do that. So I think we ended up with a handful of people who were happy to do it. And that was enough.
And you said as well, you're writing ebooks on the side. How was your kind of time split during this period? Was it ebooks was your side hustle and your agency was your main job or main role? Or did they kind of merge together and blend in sometimes there's more priority on different parts?
I mean, I think I'm always the kind of person who like blends things in, but I did consider my agency to be most of my time was spent on that because that was where most of the revenue was coming from. And then I saw the ebooks as something fun. And like sometimes they did really well financially and sometimes they didn't. So I wasn't relying on that to make my month. I also had during the same time in 2013, we launched a site called The Right Life, WRITE. And I'm bringing this up now because this was kind of like another side hustle. But what happened was because we were growing blogs for other businesses, we realized that we are creating an asset for someone. And then when they decided to stop working with us or we moved on for whatever reason, there was no upside for us in the future. And so we decided to create an asset that we could apply our own systems to. So we created this website and we treated it just like a client. And in fact, like in all of our record keeping, we had the same documents for that site like we did for a client site. And we tracked it like financially the same as we would with a client site. And we put an editor on that site, just like we did for all our client sites, and had freelancers write for it, just like we did for all our client sites. So we applied all the same systems to this asset that we then owned ourselves and grew that from nothing to, this is really fast forwarding, but I ended up selling that site about a year ago in 2021. But yeah, I brought that up just because like it was also another like piece of a side hustle. But the way we thought about it at that time was I thought of like our pie of our client pie, and it was just like a slice of that client pie, just like any client would have been.
So when you got acquired, you still kept The Right Life separate to that, and it's kind of your own project that you could do on the side too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I didn't sell that as part of the sale. I kept that. But however, once I got to the penny hoarder and I had 2 kids under 2 years, I had no time to work on that site. So I really wasn't working on that while I was there. What I did was I had an editor who was overseeing the site and kept just growing the site. There was a year there where like what I tried to do was say, okay, I just want to make enough money to cover the costs of growing the site so it continues to grow over time. But I wasn't like taking home. And before I went to the penny hoarder, I was personally taking home money from that site. But once I went to the penny hoarder, I just wanted to run and not cost me money and like continue to grow. So there was a year there where things got really busy and I looked at the finances for that site and I was like, oh my gosh, we're overspending here. So I moved some things around and really just had it working so that we'd make as much as we needed to spend to cover it, to run it. And that's how it grew for the next few years. I really didn't spend, I didn't have the time to spend on it personally.
And then with The Right Life getting acquired, was that more intentional because you wanted it to get acquired at that stage?
I didn't grow it. I didn't intend on it at the beginning. So I did not start it with that in mind. But after I left the penny hoarder, I came back to that site and partly because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I had all these questions like, do I want to work on this more? Do I want to make this my main source of income? It's funny. I put together a marketing plan of like, and a business plan. Like, what would I do with the site if I were to keep it and turn it into my main form of income? And when I looked at that, I thought there was a lot of opportunity there, but I really just realized like this felt like who I was 8 years ago. Like when I started it, I wasn't really that interested in it anymore. And I was ready for a new challenge. And so that's when I said, okay, I'm going to intentionally set this up so that I can sell it. So I took the next year and I played around with the SEO a lot. And that was fun for me. And it was a time to learn and get in the weeds a little bit. But I had in my mind during that time as well that I was going to sell it. So I was doing the things I needed to do to get it ready.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who started online business more recently who perhaps haven't thought that far ahead yet, where they're building their own online brand and they're trying to build their website, their SEO. And like I said, in 8 years' time, if people are doing what they're doing now, they might not be interested in that anymore. And they don't want to be stuck still building that same business, even though it doesn't really interest them. So for those people who know that they're going to want something new in the future, what advice would you give them so that they can set up their blog or their brand to be acquirable?
I mean, the cool thing is that a lot of the things that you can do to make your brand acquirable are the same things you should do to build a healthy business. Often, I mean, I've talked to people before who have taken steps to make their business acquirable and then realized, oh, actually, this is now more profitable, or it's now more enjoyable to run and I want to hold on to it. So I think thinking in that way can actually, as long as you don't get too far ahead of yourself, can help you make the business into something that you want to keep. So there's a couple things I think about. One is, I mean, eventually making it so that it can run without you. And you can't do that in the very early stages of a business. Like, I'm not doing that yet with They Got Acquired, my new company, because I'm just figuring out like, what are the things that we're even doing? Once you figure them out, then you can have someone else, you can document it well enough that someone else can do it. But you should be able to, in an ideal world, your business could run without you, or you're really clearly defined what your role is and who would need to replace you and how they would do the jobs that you're doing to keep it going. So that's one thing. And I mean, that definitely falls under the umbrella of something you want to do anyways, because it makes the business easier to run. It gives you time on the weekend to do your own thing and you're not working yourself into the ground. Another piece that is talked about more often, but really a good move, is just keeping your financials really clean, especially if you have multiple projects, which like a lot of us do, especially bootstrappers and indie hackers. We all have lots of different projects. Keeping the financials really clean between them. And that doesn't mean that you have to have an LLC for every project. You definitely don't. But within your bookkeeping, you need to be clear on where you're earning and spending your money and which project that should be attributed to, so that if you need to provide financials down the line to a potential buyer, you can do that without it being a ton of work, cleaning everything up. And again, like that's actually a really good business move, because, I've made this mistake myself where I don't track things well. And I might think one project is making the money when it's actually a different project that's making the money, or I'm not really clear on like where I'm spending. So I think being clean about that from the beginning is both a good business practice and it will set you up to be acquired.
I think one of the hard things for many entrepreneurs is they feel like they're the only person who can do a job. So to your first point, and often that's not true. Usually you can train other people to do what you're doing. And I know that, so for example, with this podcast or with my other podcast, when I'm editing it, I've got a very specific way I want it to be done. But realistically, 99% of the people listening aren't going to notice that. But then I might be really picky and spend too much time on it with someone I've hired to edit it for me. And I think part of it is kind of really understanding what's the most important things for people you hire to do, and accepting they're not going to do it exactly your way. Did you struggle with that at all when you were hiring first as an agency, then for the right life as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always tricky. I don't personally struggle with delegating because I like to delegate, and that's how my mind works. Like I like to arrange all the pieces so that other people can do the job. But it took a lot of practice to figure out, how do I get that information out of my head and into their head? One piece of that, I think, is just really not only finding good people, but training them really well, because you can't give someone an assignment and expect them to do it exactly how you would do it unless you give them really detailed step-by-step instructions. And then the first time they turn it in, you give them feedback. Like, I would like this part to be different. So it takes time to get the right people in place who can do that. One person who's really good at this, who I watch, is Laura Roeder. She's the founder. She just sold Meet Edgar, and we have her on our podcast, which we're in the middle of launching right now. And she said something in that podcast that's really good. I think it made it into the podcast from the interview. But she talks about how there's a certain number of things that have to be done in a business. And there's two different levers that you can pull to decide. Like she says, like the two different levers are who does the work, whether it's you or somebody else, and then over what time frame that they do the work. So we all assume, everything has to be done as soon as possible, but that's not necessarily true. Like some things do have to be done quickly. Other things can take longer. And I think being okay sometimes with a little bit slower growth is healthy for an entrepreneur, as long as you're putting your effort into the right places. But yeah, she talks a lot about how, like, yeah, things have to get done, but why would I have to be the person who does it? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, to think that you're the only person who can do something is really crazy. Like, maybe you're the only person who can drive the strategy for your company, but there are a million things that other people can do for you that can help you move forward. And I mean, for me, the big balance is striking a balance between spending money on that, especially when you're bootstrapping, is like, I see lots of opportunities for delegating, but I want to be careful on how much money I'm spending. So thinking about like, where does it make the most sense to spend that money and where should I do it myself?
On the delegation side as well, there's two different kinds of people you can hire too, right? You can hire people who are already experts and they're likely to be quite expensive, or you can hire people and train them yourself, which might mean that their quality isn't as good, but they're going to be much cheaper. And it's a struggle, I think, for many people to know which level to go to, because right at the beginning, you might not be able to hire an expert, but then hiring somebody and training them yourself is also a big time investment. So sometimes it works out more expensive in the short run. And it's just that struggle. Have you gone through this process yourself, and what?
Yeah, every day.
What side do you tend to go for?
Well, I think that like if you can pay more, it's worth it. But usually you have to go through a company or two before you can get to that point. Like when you're just starting out, you're not going to have the money to pay. And I really like to find people who have a lot of potential, who like aren't at the height of their career. So I don't really look for complete newbies when I'm hiring for something, but I'll try to find someone who is pretty good, and probably you'd have to pay more than you have to pay an entry level person, but they're going to make it a lot easier for you. And honestly, like over time, it's so worth it. Like here's one way I think about it is I'm often hiring writers and editors, because I mostly run content sites and we need writers and editors. And if I don't want to spend that much on a writer, I end up spending more on the editor, because they have to spend more time editing the content to get it to a point where I want it to be. So you spend the money either way. So I find it's better, like whenever you can afford it, to pay a little bit more and get that really good person in place. The other way that this affects me and what I think about is when you pay more, you're more likely to keep the person. And if you don't pay enough, then they're not going to stay with you because they'll have other better paying opportunities. And when you find someone good, it's so much work, time, effort, money to find another person if they leave. So I think of spending a little bit more as a retention mechanism, so that, I'm saving my own time by keeping them on board.
Yeah, and it's a good point as well, because when you've got that person who's on board, and I've seen it, like, for example, when I was an employee at my own company, where the worst thing to do is to offer somebody a raise when they're leaving, because by then they've already made the decision that they're ready to go. And like full credit to my previous employer is that they said, like, we understand you want to do something different now, and good luck with it. Like, we support you. They didn't try to increase the money because they knew the reason I was leaving wasn't necessarily about the money, but I'd already kind of decided I want to do something different. And I think it's something which, with entrepreneurs, because you're caught up in your own vision, right? You believe in what you're doing, your mission, but sometimes the people you hire aren't on the same level. They like what you're doing, but they've got other opportunities too. With They Got Acquired now, how many people do you have working for that?
We have about 10 freelancers. It's a lot of reporters and, a podcast producer, a designer, but they're all freelancers and contractors. So what I try to do is, and again, it's hard. It's not easy, but I try to figure out like what motivates each person and what matters to them. And a lot of time pay is part of that, but there's other pieces too. Like pay is not everything. And sometimes you could be willing to pay a lot and still have a hard time finding a good person. Or not a good person, but a person who's good at the work. So yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out like what's working for you here. What do you want to be better? And some common themes I see among freelancers is some really want to be part of a team, even if they're not an employee. So, we use a tool called Twist. It's a Slack alternative that de-emphasizes urgency. So we use that to all talk to each other. And I find some freelancers really enjoy that. It's like they get to connect with someone else. They're hearing a little bit more about what's happening with the business, not just like the tasks that only pertain to them. And some freelancers don't want to do that, and that's okay. They'd rather just like turn in their deliverable and be done with it. But for people who community does matter to, that's one way to increase the value of the offer that I'm giving them. Another thing that people tend to like is flexibility. So, building flexibility into our deliverability schedule. So, for example, like yesterday, I was trying to get a new writer on board, and I had said to them, hey, I'd like to have someone who can do around one post a week. But she said, can you give me the assignments in advance? And I said, sure, like for the type of work we're doing, you can do all 4 at the beginning of the month if you want. It doesn't have to be on a weekly schedule. Like, I don't care when you do them, as long as I get this much value from you over time. So just looking for ways to make it fit into someone else's schedule, I think, is really an underrated way of finding good freelancers. Like and when you find someone who works really well and you're willing to, I mean, I'm not saying like you should bend over backwards to create an atmosphere that works for someone when it's not what you want to do. But if there's a way to make it a win-win, then you're also more likely to keep that person over time, which is huge for the business.
I do some freelancing myself, and what I found is that, especially at the beginning when you're working with somebody new, you've got a bit of a honeymoon period, right? Where it's all new, so you're learning and there's lots going on. But what I found is for some of my clients is that it's quite, I use the word lumpy for this, where it's some weeks might have, can you write 3 pieces? Some weeks will be no pieces. Some weeks will be 10 pieces. And that kind of messes with my schedule. So having a lot of pieces ordered means a lot more money, but it also means that what I was thinking about doing that week is no longer possible. And in that regard, I'll turn down the money because I've got other plans. I've got my own brand that I'm building. I've got all these other problems and things I'm working on. And when somebody can say to me, for example, okay, I'm going to give you this kind of level of stability, that's very attractive. And it's one of those odd things about entrepreneurship is that people leave their jobs to become free, but then the stability is so alluring still, where if you know you're going to get this amount per month because you're going to write this many articles, that's very attractive too for certain kinds of people. Have you found that as well, where because you can say,
like, I usually ask questions, because one mistake that I found myself making is assuming that other people are motivated by the same things that I'm motivated by. And I make that mistake again and again in my career, and I feel like I have to keep relearning it. But I've had instances in my career where I've offered a rev share to someone thinking like, oh, that will really motivate them because that would motivate me. But it didn't really, I was like, their mind didn't work that way, So it wasn't the best way to structure the arrangement. But what we're talking about now in terms of stability, like if you can ask a bunch of questions to get at what matters to this person, maybe they really want to have a recurring fee every single month. Like they want to know, I'm going to make $1,500 from this client every single month. And just being able to count on that makes them feel really good. Then they're more likely to stay with you too. So yeah, I think it's just another way to find out like what matters to the people that you're working with and how can you make it a win-win for both parties. And I mean, from my perspective too, like I want that too. I want to know them that they're going to be available for me for those pieces every month too. So like it benefits me as an employer as well.
I think revenue share is really interesting too, because it makes sense if it's a long-term project. If the connection isn't so strong, then in effect, I know people have done this, for example, on courses, where they've got a revenue share of somebody's course when they've been making the course with them. If that course doesn't sell, then they put in a lot of hours and aren't going to see much financial benefit. And that can be a demotivation factor where you think, oh, I've already done 20 hours of work, but I don't even know if it's going to pay off. And it can start working into people's minds, and especially if they don't really want to be on the selling side. So if they're just doing all of the back end stuff, then how much money they make from it isn't really dependent on them. It's dependent on how much their partner is going to sell. And it kind of creates this uneven relationship.
For it to work, you definitely the person has to have a way to influence the sale. Otherwise, it doesn't even make any sense because, they can't play a role in making that revenue bigger.
And I think it's just, especially people at the beginning of the entrepreneurship journeys, they're thinking everybody else thinks the same way as I do. And as you said, even with how many years of experience you've got, it's still something you need to keep reminding yourself because everyone's different. And has there been any cases in the past where you've maybe done something a bit different for like an employee or somebody you've hired, and that relationship has become really strong because you made a small change to the way you work?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I think this is like something that's really undervalued at startups and just bigger companies generally. And it does become hard to scale sometimes, but just sitting down with someone and asking them what matters to you in your work. And like, I mean, I think it goes a long way. And I mean, for me, I think that's one thing that's worked really well for me in my career is having relationships with people that know that I'm not putting it on either, right? Like I truly want them to enjoy their work. I truly want this to be a win for them, because when it's a win for them, it's a win for me. Like, it's also self-serving, but when you find someone great, you want to keep them around as long as you can. So looking for ways when there are things that you can do that don't negatively affect the business, but positively make it a positive experience for the employee or the freelancer, it feels like a no-brainer.
And can you tell us more about They Got Acquired, about why you decided to make that your new full-time role and start building that project up?
Yeah. So I knew I wanted to build another media company because that's my core competency, but I also wanted to create a new challenge for myself. So the way that this is challenging is in a couple of ways. One is it's a topic that I'm not really an expert in. So we're covering acquisitions of online businesses that are less than $50 million. So between 100,000 and 50 million. And, obviously that's a lot of money, but it's also relatively small compared to the size of most acquisitions that are covered in the mainstream media. So featuring founders who are enjoying exits that are in the 6 and 7 and low 8-figure range, and showing like that's a viable path that can be really life-changing for a founder, even though it's the kind of exit that's overlooked in a lot of the big stories online. So I personally, I've had 2 of these exits myself. And both times I felt like there were a lot of pain points and things that could be better. I didn't really know where to turn for resources. I didn't know how to find support professionals to help me. I didn't know what I was doing. And how do I learn that? Because a lot of the advice too that you read and like the articles, examples that you see are people who are selling their company for hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion, So I wanted to see more examples of people that looked like me and that had the same value set that I did. And so when I set out to build They Got Acquired, I'm kind of the target market, but I'm not an expert in M&A. And through this process, I get to surround myself with people who are experts in this. So that's one way that I get to learn. And then the other way that I get to learn is we're building a database. So on the front end, if you look at the website, theygotacquired.com, you'll see lots of stories of founders who have sold their businesses. We're also building a database of those acquisitions. So that's a new way for me of monetizing a brand. We want to monetize by collecting insights in the database and selling them to people that it will be helpful for them. And that's a new way for me for monetizing. So that's another challenge built into the brand for me.
How have you found these people to interview and to get their stories? Because as you said, they're often not covered by mainstream media. So how did you go about the outreach and finding the people to learn from them?
Yeah, you know what? It's actually a lot easier than you might think. We have, in our database already, we have like 900 entries. We have a lot more entries. We have like 2,000 entries total, but we know that 900 of them meet our criteria, which is under 50 million. They're everywhere. Like, we find them we have a researcher on staff. So she finds them by mining social media. Even now that I know that I'm looking out for people who have sold businesses, like I see them all the time on Twitter, and I'll just send it over to her. There's like a lot of different publications that might mention one here or there, but they don't focus on that demographic necessarily. So there's lots of ways to find them. The bigger challenge is like reaching out to all those founders and trying to get some information from them about how much their business sold for and what did the business look like at the point of acquisition. What I'm interested in personally is like the way that people build their businesses, because, I'm a type A personality. I like to drive hard on a project, but I also have a family. And so there's a balance there with how much I can work and how much brain space I have for business. And so I find myself drawn to showcasing people who have seemingly figured out that balance, or, who we have a woman coming up on our podcast who her name is Anna Mast. And she, in the early days of her business, she built a marketplace called Boondockers Welcome for people who want to find a place to park their RVs. And she sold it last year for 7 figures. She built it with her mom, and she was only spending 7 hours a week on the company in the early days. And that increased over time. But she was a primary caretaker for her family. So she was spending a lot of time with her kids. And I just think those stories are really cool. Like, you don't necessarily have to be full-time on a project or, raising millions of dollars of VC money to build something that's meaningful. There's lots of other ways to build a meaningful startup. And that's what I'm interested in, is like showcasing those stories of people who are thinking a little bit differently about how you build.
And you've already interviewed some of these people, right? So what are some of the best lessons you've learned that you're applying to your own life and your own business?
Well, we're still early in collecting the stories. So I'm really keen to see like what kind of trends and insights we can pull out of them. But what I've noticed so far that's been interesting to me is we've seen quite a few people who have cold pitched their acquirer. So they decided they wanted to sell their company rather than going through a broker or a marketplace, which are both viable options. They decided to send cold pitches to the leaders of companies that they thought might be interested in buying their company, and it worked. So that's been cool to see as an approach. There's lots of, I'd say, first time sellers who don't expect to be selling their company, but get an offer and find themselves in that place of like, oh, how do I navigate this? Like, it's a great opportunity, but what do I do with it? So those are the types of people I also want to help, is like, I've been in those shoes, like where I'm the first time seller and figuring out, how do you do this? So we want to be the resource that people can come to when they find themselves in that position too.
What are the lessons you've learned that for the Right Life when you sold that? Obviously, you've been through one acquisition already. What did you do differently? So you said that you made sure the systems are correct, you delegated things properly. But how did you kind of put it in a window shop so that people could buy it? Did you approach people yourself, or did you get inbound offers?
Well, I had inbound offers over a period of a few years because the site had done really well in search and it's one of the most trusted brands in the writing space. So the competitors noticed it, and a few of them had approached me about purchasing it. But then I also, when I decided I want to sell it, I kind of started mentioning it quietly to certain people who were well networked, and I got a couple of offers that way too. But the thing that worked really well for me is putting together a marketing document and thinking about like, why would this be valuable to someone else? In the acquisition space, you often hear people talking about different multiples, like certain types of companies sell for certain multiples. And well, I think that's a good, like a starting point for guidance, not sticking to that all the time. I think people who stick to those multiples, like as the Bible, they're selling themselves short, because the bigger, like what any firm would do if they help you is they look at what you have and they think about, how can we position this so that it really has some value to a strategic purchaser? So someone who can, for example, combine it with something they're doing already. So you're in an instance or a situation where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, but 1 + 1 = 5. So like thinking about what that might look like for someone on the other end and putting together a marketing document that outlines that. I really enjoyed that process. I've like since helped a couple other people do that as well, because it's really about messaging and communications. And like, that's the kind of stuff that I'm good at and that I enjoy. How could what you've built be valuable to someone else, both in terms of like how much direct revenue they're going to get from the thing that you've built, but there are other benefits too. And what do those look like? And how can you outline them in a way that's really compelling?
You said you worked with other people on this as well in their businesses. Can you give any examples of where they've been able to position themselves so that the person who acquires them gets that extra value, so that 1 + 1 = 5?
There's one woman I talked to, for example, who she's also going to be on our podcast for They Got Acquired. So you can look for it. It's theygotacquired.com/podcast. Her name is Lauren. And she actually she was thinking of dissolving her business because she didn't want to run it anymore, and didn't realize that there was value in what she had created that she could sell it to someone else. And she sold her business for $180,000. So it's not a multi-million-dollar sale, but it's enough that it made a difference for her family. And that money went to the bank account where it could have just disappeared. And her business got to live on in someone else's hands. So I think that's a really interesting piece of this, is thinking about like, there's people who have businesses who don't want to run them anymore and just think, hey, I'll just shut this down, or, it'd be impossible to pass this along to someone else, when really there might actually be some value there that that's worth something to somebody.
And with your own balance now, as you said, that the balance is really important to you because you've got 2 kids and your family life as well. How much time do you spend on They Got Acquired per week? And do you have other projects as well? Are you able to kind of keep it time boxed so that you have the time to spend on other things too?
I don't really have any other projects, and I've done that purposely because I've always had side projects. And what I feel like now, my family is my side project. I have about 30 hours of childcare a week, but then I try to, whether this is a good or a bad habit, I don't, it's yet to be confirmed, but I try to add hours wherever I can. So like I get up early a lot of days. I couldn't do that when my kids are really little, but they're 4 and 6 now. So they sleep decently. So I can get up early and get a couple hours in, or like maybe I'll get a babysitter on a Sunday afternoon and get a couple hours in then. So I really just try to chip away at it. I mean, by not having other business side projects, it also lets me have more space for like my personal things. Like I like to hike, and I take, a weekday morning or 2 a week to go hiking. And I volunteer here on a trail organization. So I spend some of my time during the week doing that too. I definitely don't like work in a 9 to 5 type schedule like a lot of people do. I just go much more with like what has to get done and what kind of energy I'm feeling about I have for any given day.
You said you use Twist rather than Slack. So is most of your communication with your team asynchronous? So you don't have those set times in the calendar?
Yeah, I don't have any set times really, unless like there's something that has to be discussed. Or if I'm interviewing someone, we will have a live chat. But yeah, I try to do everything asynchronously. So we have Twist. And then I use WhatsApp and Voxer a lot to talk to different people, both members of my team, but really anybody. Like even if a founder asks me, like, can you help me with my business or help me think through something? I usually say, I try not to book live calls on my calendar, but if you want to talk about it on WhatsApp, we can do that. And that allows me to have a voice conversation with someone else without having to take the time on my calendar. I do calls during the day. It's not like I do no calls. Like I'm doing this call. I have calls mostly with different partners for the company, like people I think might be able to help us achieve something, or there's a way to work together, or interviews, but we don't have like a lot of team calls.
How much writing do you do yourself now? Are you doing They Got Acquired content yourself, or is it all freelanced out now?
I don't do any of the content myself. It's all freelanced out. But in the early days, I did a couple of the posts just to like create examples. And honestly, mine were not as good as like our writers, because that's not my primary role anymore. And also I'm not a creative writer, and I want it to be a little creative. I did just write one post last week, because it's kind of like an opinion type post that I wanted to get up. We haven't published it yet, but that's in our queue for the editor to look at. But what I do for writing is I write the newsletter, and I've been trying to, I would like to delegate that more, but first of all, I enjoy doing it. And second of all, I'm trying to figure out like the best format. And like I delegated it a few weeks ago, and then I realized I had done it too early because I wanted to change the format, and I wasn't satisfied with what we were doing. So I think I need to work on that a little longer before I'm ready to have someone else help me with it. And the other piece that I write a lot is, well, I guess it'd be called content marketing, but once in a blue moon, I'll still write a piece for my own blog. And then, I write Twitter threads, which are my kind of way of blogging now, because it doesn't take as much effort. I wrote a piece for indie hackers recently, which will end up going out in the newsletter, which helped us get subscribers. So I am doing some writing that when it helps us, basically as a vehicle for promotion. And part of that is because that's what I'm good at. And like, that's my brain goes to all those opportunities. Like, oh, we could do this, this, and this. And it helps us get backlinks as well. And I'm really keen on SEO. So that it helps us achieve a number of our goals, but it's really time consuming for me.
When you started, writing was the bit that you enjoyed the most, you said, when you were doing ebooks and everything like that. Do you find now it's shifted a bit where it's more part of the work rather than something you particularly find joy in?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, once in a while I feel inspired and I want to write something. And whenever I feel like that, I try to set aside time to write, because I know I should take advantage of it. But absolutely, like I like the business side of it now. For the first couple of months of They Got Acquired, I was doing all the editing, because editing is one of my core competencies. It's expensive to hire an editor. And so I thought, I'll do this, especially as we're figuring out what the content should look like, so I could play a role in that. But we just hired an editor, and I kind of went back and forth on like, should I hire someone to do that, or should I do it myself? Because I am good at it, and I generally enjoy editing, but it takes so many hours. And I found that I hired an editor just for 20 hours a month. And that has significantly cleared my schedule so I can think about growing the business. And like the kind of trap in a content business is you get in the trap of just creating the content and not actually growing the business. And so trying to pull myself away from that is like a constant challenge.
So it's been a pleasure to chat to you today, Alexis. Where can people hear more about you and theyGotAcquired.com?
Yeah. If you head over to theyGotAcquired.com/newsletter, you can sign up for our newsletter. And within that newsletter, I usually share a little bit each week about how I'm building the business. There or on Twitter at Alexis. I'm at Alexis Grant.